Even though AEW really hasn't been around all that long, I think it's safe to say that it still has a particular flavor, as it does have a reputation for having certain kinds of wrestlers. But with that being said, and throughout all of wrestling history, there are definitely those out there who would have been great in All Elite Wrestling if only they were around in their primes for it. Like who, you ask? Well, that's the topic of this episode, because today... A quick shout out to all of my awesome Patreon supporters such as Baba Yaga, Jeremy P, and Jeff Ang. Thank you so much for the support, it really does mean a lot. Alright, allow me to start by saying that I think Sting has proved that it doesn't matter how old you are, anybody can be All Elite, even if you thought they were retired. So don't be surprised if there are a few names on this list that still could show up in AEW at any moment. But with that, I think there is a whole slew of wrestlers that would be great in AEW, so let's try to narrow this down just a little bit. For this list, I'm looking for wrestlers who are at least quasi-retired and haven't been in AEW in any capacity. That includes backstage producers and coaches. But even with these parameters in place, there are still way too many wrestlers to fit on this one list. And in which case, let me know who you would like to have seen in AEW in their prime down in the comments. And while you're there, please make sure that you're subscribed to this channel, because that would be pretty elite if you ask me. Anyway, with all this being said, let's get into the list. Okay, so when it comes to the different styles of professional wrestling, why not start with the obvious, the stereotypical answer most people give when they talk about what AEW does, and that's, well, a lot of jumps and dives. However, if that's going to be the case, I do have to point out that that doesn't always have to be a bad thing, as you can execute that kind of wrestling with some great mat technical work as well. We all know that AEW has a reputation for that flippy stuff, that high-flying, high-kicking kind of wrestling that some fans just don't care for. And while the company is much more than that, I would say if you're going to have that kind of reputation, you might as well get the very best to ever do it. And of course, I'm talking about Rob Van Dam. RVD was known for his martial arts background as well as his amazing high-flying ability, but he's also known for being a fantastic technical wrestler, being able to chain with the likes of Jerry Lynn, who by the way is another candidate, but he works backstage as a producer. And as I alluded to earlier, RVD is still young enough where he could possibly show up in AEW, even if he is quasi-retired at this point. But whatever the case, I would still like to see RVD in AEW. Now, for anyone who's really been watching AEW recently knows there's a lot more to the company than just flips, especially since they have a lot of great mic workers who are also really tough dudes. And if we're going to be looking at wrestlers of that vein, well, there's only one person to consider at the very top of that list. Rowdy Roddy Piper's influence can be seen throughout the entire industry, most notably for AEW wrestlers such as MJF, Jon Moxley, and of course CM Punk. So now, just imagine what it would be like to have the OG there and present. The promo battles alone would make Dynamite must-see TV. But then on top of that, you get to consider the matches, as Piper is one of the absolute best at in-ring psychology. Plus, let's not forget that if we get the Hot Rod in his prime, we would get to see him go against Chris Jericho again, but this time with the age scale being reversed. Oh, and also, consider that with AEW's reputation of being an outlaw territory, having a rebel like Rowdy Roddy Piper would definitely be a boon to that exact image, and that's a good thing. Something that a lot of wrestling fans want to look down upon AEW for is the size of their talent. But I say this is nothing to be afraid of, and if you want to look at shorter talent that's really good in the ring, well, you just gotta bring up Dynamite Kid. Although I do have to say that Mark Rocco and Marty Jones were also strong candidates for this category. Anyway, back to the Dynamite Kid. For anyone who's seen his work with Tiger Mask knows that he's an absolute gem in the ring. And yes, Tiger Mask is someone else that I considered for this list as well. Anyway, moving on. If fans are excited about the potential prospect of Johnny Gargano joining AEW and they're thrilled that Daniel Bryan is there as Bryan Danielson, then of course Tom Billington is going to put fans right through the roof. I mean, come on, his name is the Dynamite Kid and Dynamite is the flagship show for AEW. And even though I was just talking about the Dynamite Kid, I have to admit Davey Boy Smith would be a pretty interesting matchup to see going against Powerhouse Hobbs and Brian Cage. With all of the tributes that AEW is doing for Owen Hart, it's quite clear that they are huge fans of his work, and it's kinda hard not to be. But furthermore than that, with his older brother Brett introducing the world to the AEW title, it would be pretty interesting if the younger brother made it as a wrestler in All Elite. And hey, if there was ever a wrestling company that was really trying to get out from underneath a big shadow, well, I do feel AEW would know something about that, making it an absolute great place for Owen Hart to show off all of his talents. And now, I'm going to be nominating a tag team that definitely didn't get all the credit that they were due in WWE. They're also a little on the smaller side, and they're also known for doing a lot of high flying. These guys sound absolutely perfect for this category, huh? All Elite Wrestling has made it something of a mission to highlight tag team wrestling. Between Jack Evans and Angelico, Private Party, as well as the Lucha Brothers, there's a lot to offer when it comes to tag teams for All Elite. And while there is a whole plethora of tag teams that I would love to have seen in their primes in AEW, if I'm going to pick only one, I have to go with London and Kendrick. Again, these two were incredible high flyers, but they were also great technical wrestlers too. But moreover than that, after the way Paul London was fired because he smiled, I think having an alternative to WWE would be a nice place for the two of them. Not to mention that they were also humiliated single-handedly by Triple H. So between their skills and their axe to grind, I say London and Kendrick would be great in AEW. This was really hard to narrow down, as there are tons of tag teams that I would really like to see in AEW, from the Rock and Roll Express to the Dudley Boys to even Harlem Heat. But nevertheless, I'm going with Paul London and Brian Kendrick. Now, as hard as it was to choose for that last category, this one is definitely way tougher, as there are plenty of talents out there who could have fit this list. But if I was going to go for only one, well, I know just who to pick. It's no secret that AEW's women's division isn't exactly the highest point of the company, and while they have shown a lot of improvement over the years, they're still not quite as strong as I think they could be. But if there was ever one wrestler who could really turn around the entire division, I would have to go with Gail Kim. Her work in TNA alongside Awesome Kong was one of the best parts of the Knockouts division, and if you ask me, she is one of, if not the, greatest female wrestlers of all time, and just one of the best wrestlers, period. Just imagine the work she could do going against Dr. Britt Baker or having a feud with Sheeta. If there was ever one woman to book an entire division around, I say Gail Kim is it. Now of course, I would always want to know what would happen if Awesome Kong was there in her prime, but she was there in some capacity, so couldn't put her on this list. But anyway, just food for thought. Now, I couldn't possibly forget about AEW's rep as a comedic company, but if you ask me, there's a real fine line between funny and just not a good fit for pro wrestling. So, who do we get to walk this line? Well, what does everybody want? What does everybody need? There's no question that those in charge of All Elite Wrestling have a particular sense of comedy. However, there are many people out there who completely disagree with their brand of humor. And so, if we're looking to incorporate just a little bit of the haha, well, who better to do it than Al Snow? A really solid in-ring talent to be sure, he's also someone that knew how to get over with the fans. And while his particular brand of humor was just a little bit on the blue side, it still worked, and it's something that I think the fans today would really get invested in, especially if it was coming from this former member of the Job Squad. I mean, could you imagine how funny things would be if you saw Al Snow teaming up with Orange Cassidy? Now personally, I think Al Snow is the perfect blend of both of these worlds, and a lot of wrestlers could only stand to be so lucky. Now, for this category, I do want to highlight that AEW does some great work with international talents. However, that doesn't narrow things down because I have an entire planet to choose from. But at any rate, if I was only going to be looking at one other professional wrestling country, well, I know just the one. Let's also remember that AEW does a lot of work with AAA, and they have a pretty strong luchador presence. So who better to go along with that than a strong luchador? And while there are a lot of wrestlers from Mexico who could fit this bill, I say going with a pretty powerful one like Psicosis is the way to go. When we look at a lot of the AEW wrestlers from south of the border like Pentagon Jr. and Andrade, we see that they don't have the stereotypical body type that many people think of when they think of Lucha Libre. But on that note, I think a wrestler like Psicosis would fit in perfectly, especially considering that it was always really impressive that a man of his stature could wrestle in the style that he does. Now, I do also want to take the time to point out that Lucha Libre isn't just all about lighter weight classes who do high-flying maneuvers, even though that's what some people think. But the truth is, luchadors come in a wide variety of shapes and sizes, and they have a whole plethora of moves to choose from. I just want to highlight a taller luchador who happens to do a lot of cool high flying. In the beginning of this video, I did point out that I'm looking for wrestlers who will take what AEW is known for and improve upon it. Well, if there was ever one major colossal failure for All Elite Wrestling, well, we gotta talk about one thing in particular, don't we? Let's go back to that ring that never quite exploded. This was a complete embarrassment for the entire company. So to rectify this, we need somebody with, let's just say, experience on how to do these types of matches right. And while Atsushi Onita might be the obvious choice here, let's not forget that he did make a small cameo for AEW already. But if we're gonna stay away from him just because of this quick appearance, who else could we possibly get for this type of match? Well, there are plenty of other candidates, but personally, I'm going with the Funkster. Terry Funk has a well-deserved reputation for being wild and crazy, and to boot, he also already had a match with Onita. While AEW is not all blood and guts despite what some people want to claim, I also can't pretend like it's not part of the climate, and while I typically don't go for that kind of wrestling myself, I have to say if you're gonna do it well, and it's hard to do it better than Terry Funk, especially when we remember all of his matches with Mick Foley, Jerry Lawler, and his time in ECW. And so if you're looking for a hardcore wrestler, well, why not go with one of the very best with Terry Funk? Now, I saved the best for last, as this entry, I'm sure, would never happen under any circumstance. Okay, I completely understand that the odds of this happening and also the odds of it working out long term are very slim to none. But let's not forget that Tony Khan himself has referenced that Jim Cornette is a major influence on a lot of the changes that we've seen in AEW over the past couple of years. There is a lot that a mind like Corny's has to offer AEW, and if they could make it work, it would be great to see happen and would really help the company to flourish. Sure, I know this is much easier said than done, but when I look back at Jim Cornette's work in Ring of Honor and Smoky Mountain Wrestling, I can't help but think of how much Cornette would really improve things for the WWE alternative that is AEW. Well, there you go. 10 talents that I would love to have seen in AEW in their primes, but who do you got? Let me know down in the comments, and again, please make sure you're subscribed to this channel. Anyway, thank you so much for watching, and as always, Dave knows.